Hey, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara.
Vanessa, you know how we stay away from the word normal? Yeah. Today's episode is the opposite of that because we are talking to Jessica Zucker, who is a psychologist who actually specializes in reproductive health and writes a lot about her own lived experience with miscarriage. And Jessica's new book is called, wait for it, Normalize It, which is actually, even though I really don't like the word normal, is actually the perfect title for this book.
Yeah, I mean, her goal is to normalize conversations about big, complicated topics that girls and women in particular are often socialized not to talk about, to sort of bottle up and put to the side at the risk of their own mental health and self-esteem and, frankly, safety. And I just want a quick note for a trigger warning. There are descriptions of miscarriage in this episode, and we do have conversations about sexual violence and sexual assault. So for anyone for whom that may not be a safe topic today, just want to let you know, press pause on this episode. And Jessica's goal is really to use storytelling and open conversation to get people in a place where they're sharing about these things because it serves us emotionally. It's better for our health. It's better for our relationships. It's certainly not easy, but it's important. And we talk about things like period stigma. We talk about things like miscarriage and sexual assault. We talk about things like the ends of friendships and romantic relationships. So really big, weighty topics.
One of my favorite parts of the conversation is the part where Jessica, who has written about this, who has trained in this, who works in this field with adults, talks about her own inability to apply a lot of these lessons to her own kids and how vulnerable that feels and how confusing it feels. And I mean, regular listeners know we feel that way too. Just because you have knowledge doesn't mean you feel like you can apply the knowledge in your own home. And that feels pretty darn human. I want to normalize that, Vanessa. Hope you enjoy.
Hey, Jessica, we're so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your writing is full of personality and effervescence and personal storytelling and the storytelling of others. But for those who haven't yet had a chance to read your writing, would you share with our listeners just a little bit about what you do professionally and your personal experiences, specifically as it relates to destigmatize topics and stories around complicated or unspoken issues?
Sure. How much time do you have? I could go on for days. All right. Well, I'm a Los Angeles-based psychologist. I specialize in women's reproductive and maternal mental health, and have done so for about 15 years at this point. And I come to the field with a background in public health. So I have been working in women's rights and women's health internationally. And when I decided to pursue my PhD, my hope was to marry my interests in my clinical practice. Up until that point, I had no sort of personal experience that led me to this career path. It was just, I was passionate about all things women until I went through something horrendous. So 16 weeks into my second pregnancy, I had a miscarriage while I was home by myself. I was coached by phone by my OBGYN how to cut the umbilical cord and promptly began to hemorrhage. My husband was darting through LA traffic to get home to me, and he found me there on the toilet with the fetus next to me. So my doctor suggested that we promptly get to her office and bring the fetus for testing. And to make matters all the more traumatic and dramatic, when I got there, I was basically faced with the, I guess, quote unquote, choice to either undergo an unmedicated DNC or wait for anesthesiology and have a blood transfusion. And so I just yet again was stunned beyond belief. I mean, psychologically just terrorized, and physically having gone through so much already. And I figured, let's just get this done. Let's do what is the quickest and not the least painful, but just, would get me to a place of safety faster. So I underwent the unmedicated DNC, which is something that will be seared into my cells and my psyche for the rest of time. I share all of this because I had been sitting across from women telling me about the pain, the anguish, the isolation, the alienation they felt in the aftermath of pregnancy loss and life after. And now I was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
And so this is sort of the birth of storytelling for me. I mean, I had always been a writer and had loved telling stories and was freelancing and stuff, but I turned to the research after my loss, and it shows that a majority of women are blaming themselves for something they had no hand in, that they're feeling a sense of shame and self-blame and body hatred even. And I couldn't sort of stand for that. I couldn't not do anything, I guess.
Why?
I know.
Why do we do this? What does the research show? What does your own experience with patients tell you?
Yes. Here's the thing. My biggest concern as a psychologist in this, what I call this swirling trifecta of silence that begets the stigma, that begets the shame. I am incredibly concerned about the shame piece. What happens there? Right? So there's cultural silence. We are taught to keep it to ourselves, to be hush hush, to manage our feelings on our own. Then there's the stigma. Oh, don't talk about it. People will think something is wrong with you. Grief is not something that society, enjoys swimming in. And then it's the shame. And the shame is where we are psychologically in so much pain. The shame is when we think, am I bad? Is something wrong with me at my core? Right. And so I do think this happens because of this swirling, antiquated trifecta. And it leaves people then thinking, maybe I should be quiet about this. If I'm receiving these platitudes and this feedback and these, stunted looks from people when I do share, maybe I should shut up. Right. And then that leaves us all the more alone and feeling like maybe we did have a hand in this. And again, I think that this is incredibly female focused based on girlhood, right? I think this starts at the beginning of time. I don't think men would say, I think I caused my miscarriage, but this is me just speculating. So I have no research there.
Let's go there though, because I think the origin story of that shame, I mean, it's something we talk about on this podcast a lot. It's something we write about a lot from the tween and teen perspective. And, there are lots of ways in which shame is conferred upon kids as they're growing up. But let's talk specifically about the origin of shame among women and how it gets to this place where this trifecta, as you've described, just it kicks in so fast, right? It's like, it's almost like muscle memory. Like the minute you have this one lived experience, you get sucked into down this rabbit hole of the silence and the stigma and the shame. So can we go to sort of the origin of it a little bit?
Yes. I mean, so my new book, Normalize It, starts with girlhood and goes all the way through menopause and tries to sort of take on all the milestones in women's lives. And I do think it begins in girlhood. And so I referenced Dr. Carol Gilligan's groundbreaking research because I had the opportunity to study with her, which was amazing. And I just look up to her so much because she sat with these girls and really got into it, she was able to sort of get to the root of it. So what is the root of it? What she found is that girls know what they know, as she says, until they sort of hit this ceiling or this wall.
Mm.
And what is that? That's culture. And then she saw that they began to question their feelings, their thoughts, their expression, their behaviors.
Right. I mean, you quote her, Jessica, young girls don't need to find their voice. They start out with one, but as they get older and increasingly receive cultural messages about themselves, their bodies, their brains, their desires, their worth, that voice is slowly silenced. And that quote just about did me in. But it doesn't have to be a fait accompli. I mean, I spent years coaching girls in sports for this very reason, right? To give them a voice, to empower them before the world silenced their voice. Your work is around storytelling and using storytelling in addition to, clinical settings and therapy to help women find their voices. But it's hard, and you're pushing back against a culture and a world that's telling you to be quieter, that you're too much, that to stay silent. And the book explores really big, hard topics, things like body image, things like sexual assault, things like motherhood in its most complex form, right? So these are really big conversations, and your message is, I mean, obviously the title of the book is Normalize It, but your message is, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. And let's also be in conversation with the people in our lives about how we talk about it, which is essentially, we spend all day, every day talking to parents and caregivers about that in the context of puberty. So I'd love to start with period stigma and menstruation as a source of shame, and this feeling that, kids feel like they need to hide their periods, right? It's sort of like, it's millennia of shame, and women literally being put physically apart when they're menstruating. So as we explore shame and we explore, stigma and all of those things, let's start with periods and how we shift the messaging and the storytelling.
I mean, I think it's right before the periods, actually, because my daughter is 11 and I'm just waiting for that day to come. And I am seeing in her, unlike my 16-year-old son, I'm seeing in her self-consciousness. I'm seeing in her sort of wanting, body privacy, and making some comments sort of about her changing body. And it's interesting because I would think, since my kids have grown up in the same household, that, they would feel the same level maybe of comfortability. But that's an interesting assumption, because girls are getting messages outside of the household. And I think a lot of things are happening at school and among peers. And so I think, with Carol Gilligan's research, I think it's basically an exploration of what is happening just before periods. And then, to make matters all the more complicated, we get our periods, right? So I think it's already bubbling before we start to bleed. And then we're told, smile, you'll get through the day, be a good girl. Don't talk about your symptoms. Oh, you need to go to the nurse? Okay, we'll call your parents and you'll go home. So there isn't a lot of psychological exploration in schools, and maybe among families that could be absent as well if the parents aren't educated about this. And I'm even thinking about sort of, what will I do when my daughter gets her period? What is the best way to respond so that, because people are talking about like period parties and period pride, is there something in between pride and shame? And that's what I'm really aiming for. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, right. And I think it's interesting you use the phrase bubbling up. I love that phrase because, when you look at how bodies transform through these years, female bodies tend to transform in a more obvious way breast buds poke out, curves appear. That word bubbling up is it's sort of like a perfectly descriptive term for what is happening that cannot be ignored if someone is actually an observer of what's going on. The world sees all of this. Whereas when boys go through their physical transformation, it tends to be, until they hit that stage of voice cracks and, the hair everywhere, it tends to be more subtle. It tends it does not bubble to the surface in the same way.
Yeah.
And so the origin story of some of this shame, it has got to be that sort of physical piece, right?
Uh-huh.
But then you talk so beautifully about the layering on of the socialization and the psychological impact of, of this rite of passage of the period.
I think also what happens is we're driving around, or the kids are online, or they see a magazine at the market. And although, there are, of course, pictures of naked men or, shirtless men, I should say, as well, we see so much more objectification of girls and women.
Driving around, because you and I live in Los Angeles.
Yes,
and let me just be clear that, oh my God, what is on billboards and buses is jaw-dropping.
Yes.
It is jaw-dropping.
Yes. And then you start to hear, or at least I do, questions related to my daughter sort of comparing and contrasting. And so it starts that young.
So, Jessica, let's talk about that, because you explore a term, self-objectification, and define it as the process by which women and girls begin to attach their own feelings of worth to their bodies and their bodies alone. And listen, we've read a gazillion books and interviewed a million people about the topic of, body image and self-esteem and cultural messaging to girls. But there was something about that term that was like a gut punch. And it's a conversation I have over and over again with my sister and my close friends, this sort of fighting against this feeling that our worth is about our bodies and how our bodies look. And you speak of research, that self-objectification leads to lower self-esteem, higher anxiety, lower motivation, worse performance in physical tasks. I mean, the list goes on and on. How do we address this messaging that kids are getting from everywhere, right? From billboards on down to buses and magazines and tech and all of those places. How do we address it? How do we push back on it?
I mean, it is an amazing question. The truth is, I don't specialize in working with kids. And so that's why I find myself all the more terrified about going through this with my daughter. I mean, it's like I'm able to write about it, but to know the answer of how to handle it in real time still concerns me. It still worries me. And so I think that my hope is that within the family, if I can model for my daughter open dialogue, if I can model for her saying nice things about myself in the mirror, or not even spending much time in the mirror, I don't want her to see this idea of self-objectification. So we are objectified, right? As women, men are too probably, but more so women. And so this idea of self-objectification, we then begin to surveil how we look, what we wear, how many people are looking at us. Can I wear a shorter crop top so that more people look at me? What are the responses that I get? And then we learn to almost rely on an outside source, somebody other than ourselves, to tell us, you're worthy, you're beautiful, you're hot, you're sexy, you're whatever. And unfortunately, none of this has to do with our brains or our true capacities as people. It's all about looks. So my hope is that if the family unit because I can't do anything about what's happening at school except be at a school environment that I, have researched and feel good about. But again, still things can happen on the playground that I don't know about and that I can't control. If in the family we can talk openly about, how do you feel? What are your questions? What does it mean to be a girl in this world with a changing body, growing into womanhood? Because my daughter is open, even with her pediatrician when we go annually. She's like, I don't really want to get older. I don't want to go through puberty,
Right.
So she wants to remain young. And yet some of her peers are already sort of embracing it and wearing the crop tops and the lip gloss and all the things.
So, Jessica, what advice would you give a patient or someone sitting in an audience hearing you speak about your book when they say, help me help my daughter not self-objectify? What does it look like and sound like for us as parents and trusted adults to help kids develop a sense of self-worth and model that sense of self-worth without sounding like this? You shouldn't just care about how you look.
I know.
It shouldn't just be about how your body is shaped, right? So are there nuggets of advice that you have for the adults? Maybe it's just how to talk about their own worth, but that's what people seem to be starving for. Right?
I know. I feel like it may be simpler than all of that. I think it's if the adults are modeling self-worth and self-esteem and confidence and focusing on one's accolades and accomplishments and being present. I think our kids will find it pedantic if we, say these little things like, oh, you're beautiful inside and out. It's like, I just don't know if they'll believe that.
No, they won't believe
that sinks in.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's really about getting to know them. I mean, the truth is, I think when people feel psychologically held, when they feel seen and understood and cared for through and through, that's when we see self-esteem in a heartier place. When the kids know that they can come to us and talk to us about anything and we can handle it, I think that they think that they're safe. And, that's the ideal container.
I want to offer a contrast to that, which is the sort of perfectionist epidemic.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't use that phrase loosely or casually. And, we will talk about the loneliness epidemic that is actually studied and researched and quantified. But in our experience, perfectionism is just this insipid force in kids' lives. We see it as such a powerful force in girls and young women. And you meet with adults who are struggling with their own perfectionism and the ways in which it gets in the way of them telling their stories, being their authentic selves, finding help, asking for support, and really struggling with the downstream mental health impacts like depression and anxiety from a lifetime of perfectionism.
True.
How do we model for kids and also create environments where we make space for them to pursue achievement, right? To pursue who they can become without risking their mental health, without pushing them towards this perfectionism, because we want them to fulfill their capacity and capability, right? We want them to succeed in the world, and yet somehow the messaging, the wiring gets crossed.
I know. I mean, this is a really tough question because I agree with you. We want to support our children in achieving what they're capable of achieving, but we don't want to be part of this sort of, you have to achieve at the highest level in every single thing that you undertake. I think it's about asking the questions, what do you love? What do you like? How are you feeling? Because I mean, it becomes robotic, right? To just be like, well, you'll get that A, right? You're ready for the test. You got to get the A. You got to get the... And there's so much focus on the externalization of achievement and then being able to walk around saying, you know, I got this, I got that, I got accepted here and there. Is the child happy? Is the child feeling supported in what they're doing? Kids become, I think, perfectionistic when they see, well, it comes from so many things, but I think this kind of, if I make a mistake, then somehow I'm less good as a person. And I don't know.
The shame comes back, right?
Exactly.
There's no room for mistakes.
Right.
And then they imagine they play it forward. How do we message it? Because when we think about ourselves, like, how much room do we give ourselves
I mean, right,
for making mistakes?
And how do we, like, point. I'm imagining that the adults that you speak to in your office, many of them cannot answer these very hard questions. What makes you happy? What fills your cup, right? How can we then imagine that the kids in our lives can begin to understand the answer to that question, right? They don't know yet.
No, and it's true. I mean, we're sort of swirling in this mental health epidemic, and we're all part of it, even if we don't want to be, in a way. And so how can we, as you're asking, like, step out of it and inspect it and decide where we want to be within it as adults? Kids can't do that. And then how do we model that for them to be able to ask the questions and find a sense of joy and fulfillment?
When you see a patient in your office who is just textbook perfectionist, and you talk about a patient who is just driven by anxiety, and the anxiety is both kind of driving them to succeed and also just putting them in a really unhealthy place emotionally, where do you help them get back to in that, in sort of like, do you look for the root of it? Do you sort of, because you tell stories of folks grappling with that?
Yes. I mean, and that's why this is, these are very tough questions, because it's not like a therapist or any trained professional can just hand somebody a toolkit and then they can implement it. It doesn't work like that. So that's what I love so much about my job, is this kind of deep exploration. But it's hard, and it can take years to get to the root of it. So typically people come to me in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and maybe they just had a miscarriage. Maybe they just had a stillbirth. Maybe they're having trouble getting pregnant. Maybe they decide they don't want to have children. And what does that mean? But then it leads us into all of these things that we're talking about now. The perfectionism and not being able to sustain a pregnancy is pretty much the most crushing thing for people who have been taught that they can achieve anything they put their mind to. It's not true.
And also that your body is built to do this, and you're supposed to, and all the, those are messages that are internalized from minute one.
Exactly.
That you arrive.
And smile through it all. Right? Like, but I was just thinking about a friend who has suffered from several miscarriages and then was able to have another child. And she is the most sunshiniest, most joyful, warm human being. Like, she literally smiles on the world. And we were talking about what it felt like to go through such loss and such grief and be that person who, and many of us feel this, who are, you just keep smiling through it all, which is so detrimental. And Jessica, you write about that, and sort of giving ourselves permission to share the stories, even when the people we share them with look back at us like, oh my God, I can't believe you just said that. Like, I can't believe you just told me that story.
Yeah.
I want to then take that and apply it to something that Vanessa and I talk a lot about, which is how to leave your own baggage at the door as you're managing this sort of coming of age with the kids in your life, right? Because if your own personal story, if your narrative and your lived experiences shape who you are, how you feel. They're integral to each of our characters. And yet, the experiences that kids are living are not our experiences. And so there's this balance that has to be struck between bringing our lived experience into the conversation, into the modeling, but also not making their growing up about us. So looking at it through, right? So looking at it through the lens of someone who works with adults, how might you help adults to both learn the lessons of what they've lived through and to evolve to a certain place through those lessons, but also how to not sort of have that color their lens when they're guiding kids?
I mean, again, this is an impossible feat, which I hope many people are trying so hard to master in a way, but this takes amazing amounts of self-reflection and insight to be able to, as you say, leave your own stuff at the door. And the truth is too, our lives are happening while our kids are growing up. So my daughter is, going through hormonal changes. My son is too. I myself am going through perimenopause. And so how do we balance all the hormones taking place within, one household? That's an interesting conundrum. And then also, about 2 weeks after my first book came out in 2021, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so my family became focused on me. And this was incredibly challenging for me because I am somebody who is so dedicated to my children. And I do try to leave my childhood at the door as I parent them or to integrate it. I mean, I actually think it's almost an easier expectation for us to try to work through what we've been through, integrate that can make us into better mothers, hopefully. But here I was faced with this experience of my own potential mortality. And they're just in their prime, in their sweet little phases, going through their lives. And I did not know what to do about not making it about me. So, I use that example just to say that we can try very hard to keep ourselves out of it, but our lives are happening as well. Well, as you know, I mean, my book takes place within my fictitious office. And so ideally, people are in therapy, whether they have big T trauma, little T trauma. I, of course, as a psychologist, believe wholeheartedly in the power of psychotherapy. However, my book also points out other ways of getting help, getting support, telling our stories, making sure that we are resourced, even if we are not in therapy. So hopefully, these adults that we're talking about, if they're not sitting with me or in another office around the country, have support that they're getting so that they can have their cup filled when their kids come home from school or when, they are faced with the big questions that come up in childhood.
Right. I mean, we get this question all the time from parents, which is like, what do I share with my kid? I mean, you're encouraging us, Jessica, to tell stories, to bring stuff out into the open, to destigmatize, to normalize. And yet with kids, sometimes it's appropriate and helpful, and sometimes they either don't want to hear it, they're not interested, or it's passing the trauma on, or they're not old enough to take it on board, or to your point, they feel like they have to take care of us.
That's right.
Which, that reciprocity becomes appropriate at certain points, but depending on the age of the kid, they really want to be taken care of by us. So I'm wondering, I mean, we get a question quite often, and you talk about sexual trauma and sexual assault in the book, and share the story of one person who sort of is processing it in real time with you, not realizing what it meant, what she had been through, and sort of all of the cultural baggage of the messaging. It wasn't a big deal, and it wasn't really this or it wasn't really that, and should she share with her partner? All of the layers that we hear from folks all the time. How do we know what we can share and what we can't? And we get questions from parents all the time. They will say, I was the victim of sexual assault. It's a part of who I am. I carry it with me. It impacts so much of what I do and the decisions I make. I don't know what or how or when to share with my kids. And so I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on that.
That is probably the touchiest of subjects, I would say. I would think that it really depends on the child. It really depends on their level of maturity and the appropriateness of how that conversation goes, because we don't want to scare our kids. When I had my miscarriage, we did not tell my son. He was 3.5 at the time. We decided to say, we thought mommy was pregnant, but it turns out she's not. And we consulted with our pediatrician to find out what to say because I was clueless. So we need to be sure that our kids are ready, because when we invite them into these areas that relate to grief and death and loss and, other sort of, sexual assault, traumatic life events that they may not have hopefully been faced with, we risk something there. We risk kind of putting fear into them that perhaps they're not ready to face. So I would say that something like that can be dealt with in the context of therapy with other adults. And then if, the child seems evolved enough, I guess, maybe in their teen years or maybe older would be the time that I would think it would be the most appropriate. But what do you think about this? Because I think you know more about when kids are ready to hear something like that. I mean, I've heard from people who receive those disclosures later in life, like as young adults from their parents, because their parents didn't feel like they would be ready for it or it was appropriate. And on the one hand, okay, I get that. On the other hand, teenagers and college kids are assaulted at alarmingly high rates. Right.
And so it's like, can we educate them and be in conversation with them without just making them never want to leave the house again? Where is it appropriate to disclose or share? Can you share a little bit without sort of terrifying them or, betraying your own sense of privacy? Like it's so tricky and so complicated. But I do know that people often feel like, God, I wish I'd known that earlier.
Yes.
I wish I'd known that, before now.
I mean, I got to put on a pediatrician hat for a second and say that through that lens, it is exactly what both of you are saying. It depends on the kid, depends on the age, depends upon development, depends upon temperament, depends upon relationship, all the things. There is never one way through. It's important to not be fear-based, like all the things. But at the end of the day, what we recognize as sexual assault and sexual harassment today is actually quite different than what we recognized a generation ago.
Oh, that's important. Yeah.
Right. It's very important. And it can be the starting point of a different kind of conversation that becomes really liberating, because you can talk about definition of terms. You can talk about what is and isn't okay. You can talk about how consent has evolved over time. I personally find that these conversations are as important to have with girls as they are to have with boys. And I find that when we open these conversations with boys, it is like some serious floodgates open. Because unlike a generation ago where women were claiming their voice in this conversation, which is so critically important, now I think men are included and welcome in this conversation, right? Because the solution to a lot of this is open conversation where everyone kind of recognizes what's going on, what's not okay, where we need to communicate better, what safety looks like. So it feels to me like our path to this conversation is longer and wider than it used to be, which on the one hand, I guess you could argue, I don't want to have that conversation, let alone a longer version of it and more times and all the things. But frankly, on the other hand, feels much better. Like you can have these conversations slowly over time where they start not at all personal.
Yes.
They're about the definition of terms. They're about law. They're about realizing about personal space, right? So I don't know. I mean,
I've been talking to my son about sort of who's allowed to touch your body and who's not, since he was in preschool, both of my children. So I have not had to talk to my son about any sort of personal sexual traumas that I've been through, but I have wanted to make clear to him who can touch your body, who cannot, what does all of that mean and look like? And body integrity, this is yours, this is nobody else's. The pediatrician can, have access to your body when he was smaller, especially, but when I'm in the room and the pediatrician sort of reiterated that, of course. But now I'm talking to him about what does sexual pleasure look like? And how is he learning about that? And he says, well, obviously he doesn't really want to talk to me about it. So he says he learns it through his friends. And I think friends also means porn, maybe. I don't know. I hope not. But I mean, it happens. And so I'm trying to be very open with him without it being uncomfortable and without alienating him or me, but really sort of trying to talk about the importance of female pleasure and the importance of integrity in the bedroom. And also the fact that, he learns about consent everywhere he goes, he says. But I reiterate, if somebody seems in any which way like they're not as into it, even a kiss, this is an important thing to be careful of. And he knows, but I feel like we need to be saying this to our boys because they are the men of the future. And they are the people who can be, accused of something or could be in a bad situation as well. They need to understand, what's appropriate and what is not.
Right. And the messaging, if they are watching porn, the messaging they're getting from porn is vastly different from all the consent education they're getting elsewhere. Right. So talking to only our girls about this stuff it happens in a vacuum. It doesn't make change. I think including men and boys in the conversations is so critical. Also because many of these things affect them as well. Body image and, sexual assault and changing relationships. I mean, we should talk about you talk about changing friendships and the grief of changing friendships as part of this journey through life and the sort of unspoken stories that we all have about changing friendships. And Jessica, that is like one of the biggest things we get asked about by parents. Like, how do I handle it? Or we hear from kids like, I don't understand what's happening with my friendships. Everything is changing. And so I think those are things that we can talk to all kids about. I think girls changing friendships tend to present pretty differently than boys changing friendships. And we're at risk of assuming they don't care or it doesn't matter to them because we assume that if they're quiet about it, they don't care, which is obviously not the case. Can you talk a little bit about, there's a sort of a shame when friendships end because people internalize that feeling, or romantic relationships end, and particularly with kids now where their relationships are like part online and part in person and they ghost each other and like things sort of end. I mean, it's really painful. How do we normalize talking about that without kids feeling just like so crummy about themselves? How do we normalize our own changing relationships without feeling like we have failed?
I mean, I think the main thing here is that we talk about it. I think it's giving voice to our experiences that helps to normalize all the feelings that are, just under the surface. And I think if our kids see us being able to articulate it, hopefully they can as well. But yeah, I mean, I'm watching that in real time with my daughter, and it's so taken personally how quickly the friendships change. And how do we talk with them about it? Do we sort of get into the nitty-gritty of the dynamic? I sometimes get pulled into that, and I almost feel critical of the other child or of my child, or do we try to sort of fan out and see the bigger picture and think about, well, how are you feeling? What does this feel like? And maybe we don't use the word grief with kids, necessarily, but it's like there's grief in all of these changes. And they can come out of nowhere. I mean, I've seen with my daughter that one day they're best friends and the next week they're not. And then 2 months later, they're friends. I cannot even keep up. And I'm sure I went through that too. I've just blocked it out. But I think normalizing the conversation, because we can't sort of normalize bullying. We don't want to do that. And we don't want to normalize talking badly about the other kids or, telling our kid to stay away from this one and that one and all of them, because then ultimately they're alienated and they won't necessarily have anybody. And the thing is, they have to learn to be in their environment. And so we have to imbue them with the tools to navigate the ever-changing landscape.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that we are landing the conversation in a beautifully sort of circular place. You started with your story of your own personal grief and physical pain and terror and all the things, which, by the way, I strongly encourage our listeners to read your description. You've written about it multiple times. So there are lots of places that they can find your writing about this, but it's really beautiful. But you talk about grief, and it feels to me like a perfect place to land, which is almost normalizing that conversation too, and understanding that it is okay, whether it is about friendship, it is about body image, it is about how the world sees us as women, young women, older women. It is okay. It should be normalized to grieve what is hard, because then there is a path through, right? And there is change to be made. And it feels like that is a through line in so much of the work you do. No doubt informed by the fact that you are a therapist who is incredibly well trained. I mean, the people, the Carol Gilligans of the world who have shaped your thinking and the way that you have then helped people, both one-on-one and through your writing, is really, it's beautiful, it's remarkable, it's important. And I think this conversation is one that I hope people will go back to more than once, because it takes a while to wrap your brain around the idea of being okay with grieving something in order to grapple with it, in order to move through it. That's what normalizing does.
Amen.
Jessica, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your own stories and encouraging people to share their stories and find safe spaces to do that. My kids better buckle up this weekend, because there's just like a whole series of conversations that are going to happen.
I need to hear about those.
Offline, I'll send you an email.
Exactly. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.